In the silent forests of Maine, where mist coils through the trees like ghostly fingers, there once stood a sanctuary that promised peace, but delivered something far more terrifying. This is not the tale of witches, demons, or cursed lands. No, what you're about to hear is far darker because it is real. Hidden behind the cold stone walls of the Convent of Eternal Tears, 3 women conducted one of the most chilling chapters of human history, a story not of religious zealotry or supernatural forces, but of calculated cruelty in the name of science. Imagine a place where daughters, wives, and sisters deemed inconvenient, rebellious, or simply different were sent to be healed, only to emerge as hollow shells of their former selves, if they emerged at all. Tonight we lift the veil on a truth that history tried to bury, a truth sealed away in dusty archives and whispered rumors for over a century. But silence is no longer an option. The question is, are you brave enough to listen to it? What drives human beings to sacrifice others at the altar of progress? And more disturbingly, what happens when an entire community chooses to look the other way? Before we dive deeper, ask yourself this: in a world that celebrates science, progress, and control, how far are we really from repeating these same horrors? Because sometimes the darkest crimes are not those committed in shadows, but those carried out in broad daylight with perfect smiles, polished reputations, and the approval of those who should have stopped them. If you've ever wondered how evil hides behind respectability, how the pursuit of knowledge can blind the soul, and how society's desire for order creates monsters in its midst, this story will haunt you long after the final word is spoken. Welcome to the story of the Ashford sisters and the Convent of Eternal Tears, a place where salvation was promised, but damnation awaited. It was on a bleak October morning in 1798 that the Ashford sisters first appeared in Millbridge, Maine, a coastal settlement so small and isolated it barely warranted a name on the maps of the Massachusetts territory. The townspeople, hardened fishermen and lumber traders, gathered at the muddy crossroads where the forest met the sea, their breath fogging in the cold Atlantic air. They watched in uneasy silence as a finely crafted horse-drawn wagon rolled into view, its iron-rimmed wheels creaking over frost-hardened earth. The wagon was unlike anything the town had seen, polished mahogany with engraved panels and mysterious crates secured beneath thick tarps. It spoke of wealth, refinement, and something else, something unsettling. The woman who stepped down from the wagon commanded immediate attention. Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, a striking figure in her early 40s, carried herself with the poise of European nobility. Silver-streaked auburn hair was tucked beneath a modest veil, framing sharp gray eyes that seemed to catalog every detail around her. Her voice, crisp and composed, bore the unmistakable cadence of an educated Englishwoman. She introduced herself and her companions as Anglican nuns fleeing religious persecution, seeking to found a sanctuary of spiritual healing in the harsh American wilderness. Following her sister Prudence, Ashford descended tall and almost spectral in her thin frame. Her alabaster skin and expressionless pale blue eyes gave her the appearance of a ghost caught between worlds. Prudence spoke rarely, but when she did, her Scottish accent cut through the air with cold precision. Her hands, thin and almost unnaturally steady, moved with the grace of a master surgeon, though no one in Millbridge could yet imagine what those hands would do behind closed doors. Last came novice Temperance Ashford, barely 22, her haunting beauty drawing glances both admiring and fearful. Her raven-black hair and porcelain complexion contrasted sharply with the earthy tones of the frontier, and her dark ancient eyes seemed to study each onlooker as if they were specimens under glass. Her smile, when it came, was polite, but hollow, an echo of something human rather than the thing itself. The sisters carried with them letters of recommendation supposedly from Anglican bishops and English dignitaries. The documents were expertly forged beyond the capacity of the frontier to detect. To the pious Protestants of Millbridge, the arrival of such women was a divine gift, a civilizing force, in a land that teetered on the edge of savagery. But what the town did not know was that the Ashford sisters were not servants of God. They were fugitives from European medical circles, disgraced physicians expelled for unethical experiments, now seeking a place far from prying eyes where they could continue their work without interference. Within days, They purchased 200 acres of dense, untamed forest 15 miles inland, paying triple its assessed value. The land had long been avoided by the local Mi'kmaq and Passamaquoddy tribes, who whispered of strange happenings in the woods, but to the struggling townspeople, the Ashford's gold spoke louder than superstition. Construction began immediately. Laborers from Millbridge and neighboring towns were hired at wages far above the norm. The structure that rose from the wilderness over the next 8 months was like no convent the workers had ever seen. 3 stories of gray stone quarried from the coastal cliffs rose above the tree line. The windows were small, positioned high on the walls, making it impossible to see inside from the ground. Thick, reinforced doors and narrow corridors spoke less of spiritual sanctuary and more of containment. But it was the basement that puzzled the workers most. Its foundation was reinforced far beyond necessity, and its ventilation system was so elaborate that some thought it resembled a laboratory or prison more than a convent. When questioned, Mother Superior Agatha responded with a serene smile. Penitence requires solitude, and solitude requires containment. Our sisters in England have learned that spiritual healing is most effective when the penitent is removed from worldly distractions. For most, the explanation sufficed. Frontier life left little room for skepticism. But among the older, more seasoned workers, whispers began. Why would a house of God need drainage channels capable of flushing large volumes of liquid? Why reinforce doors as if expecting an escape attempt? Why install ventilation ducts better suited for a surgical theater than a chapel? Yet the Ashford sisters were generous employers, and their wealth brought prosperity to Millbridge. Timber sales increased, the port bustled, and the town's small church received generous donations. No one wanted to jeopardize this fragile prosperity. Not even Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the town's circuit physician who became one of the sisters' earliest allies. A man of progressive ideas and compromised morals, Hartwell was captivated by the sisters' apparent understanding of feminine hysteria and melancholia. In his journal, he described their insights as decades ahead of American medical practice. What he failed to record was their financial arrangement. For every difficult patient Hartwell referred to the convent, he received a generous stipend as well as access to the sisters' detailed case studies documents that would advance his career beyond anything the frontier could offer. And so the Convent of Eternal Tears opened its doors in 1799. The first women to arrive were those considered inconvenient or embarrassing by their families. Unmarried mothers, outspoken wives, daughters who read too much or refused arranged marriages. Women who had spoken out in church, questioned male authority, or simply failed to conform. The sisters accepted them all regardless of religious denomination. They claimed their methods transcended sectarian lines, offering universal Christian discipline that could tame even the most rebellious souls. For desperate families facing scandal, the price was steep but bearable: $20 silver for a month's treatment, $50 for 3 months, and $100 for complete reformation. Few asked what complete reformation entailed. Fewer still wanted to know. From the outside, the convent seemed a peaceful retreat. Hymns drifted through the trees in the early morning hours. Women could be seen tending gardens and walking the grounds in silent prayer. The sisters made occasional visits to town where they donated to the poor and attended Sunday service, their manners flawless and their reputations untouchable. But in the dark stone-walled basement of the convent, a very different kind of ministry was being practiced, one that had little to do with God and everything to do with control. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of Agatha Prudence and Temperance, the sisters began what they truly came to Maine to do: dissect the human mind, piece by piece, trait by trait, until the women who entered their doors were stripped of defiance, curiosity, and spirit, replaced by something quiet, compliant, and blank. And so, hidden in plain sight, the Ashford sisters began the first chapter of what would become one of the darkest experiments in American history. A chapter written not in ink, but in blood and bone. The Convent of Eternal Tears did not plunge into horror overnight. Like all true monstrosities, it grew quietly behind polished smiles and gestures of charity. In the first years after its construction, the Ashford sisters became icons of virtue in the struggling settlement of Millbridge. They attended church services with solemn piety, hosted community prayer gatherings, and donated to families who had lost husbands at sea. Where suspicion might have taken root, they sowed trust instead, and so the town, grateful for a touch of civilization in the harsh wilderness, lowered its guard. But behind the stone walls of the convent, their true work had already begun. Women labeled as burdens to their families were brought in under the pretense of spiritual correction. Unmarried mothers who refused to name their lovers' wives, who publicly challenged their husband's authority, daughters who read too many books or spoke too freely about politics. The religious divides of the time also fed the convent's intake. Puritan families sent daughters who flirted with Anglican doctrine. Anglican families disposed of those swayed by Baptist revivalism. No denomination was safe from the Ashfords' promise of transformation. They welcomed all with serene smiles and eyes that measured each woman like a specimen. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, by now fully enmeshed in their operations, became their most vocal supporter. In private, he marveled at their insights into female psychology, a field still dismissed by most of his peers. Publicly, he praised the convent's effectiveness in restoring domestic harmony. What he left unsaid was that harmony came at the cost of the human will, for each woman returned reformed. A part of her spirit had been cut away, sometimes quite literally. The convent's fees rose steadily with its reputation. $20 silver for a month's treatment, 50 for 3 and 100 for complete reformation. Soon, families from as far as Boston and Portsmouth were sending their most troublesome women northward, eager to exchange scandal for serenity. To many, it seemed like a blessing. To a few, it felt like a quiet kind of burial. The first public crack in the convent's facade came on a frozen February night in 1803. Young Thomas Brewster, a hunter raised in those woods, was tracking a wounded deer through the snow-laden trees. He knew every natural sound the forest made, the groaning of ice-laden branches, the wind through pines, the distant howl of wolves. But that night, he heard something wrong, something human. It was a scream, raw, primal, and sustained far beyond what the human throat should bear. At first, Thomas thought it was an animal caught in a trap. But as the cries rose and fell in agonizing waves, he realized with sickening clarity that this was no beast. Against better judgment, he crept closer to the stone fortress of the convent. Through a half-frosted basement window, he saw what would haunt him forever. The basement had been transformed into a surgical theater, lit by dozens of oil lamps casting harsh shadows across the stone walls. A woman lay strapped to a table, her head secured in a metal brace. Sister Prudence, her pale face flushed with concentration, guided a thin metal rod into a small, bloodied incision in the woman's skull. Temperance stood beside her, passing instruments with silent precision. Mother Agatha, calm as a scholar, took notes in a leather-bound journal as though observing a mere experiment. The woman's head was partially shaved, marked with lines of ink mapping the areas of the skull. Beneath the skin and bone, Thomas could see the gleam of exposed tissue, the very matter of thought and memory. The patient screamed and screamed until Sister Prudence adjusted her instrument, and the screams stopped like a snuffed candle. And yet the procedure continued, the sisters unfazed by their patient's silence. Thomas fled through the snow in blind terror, his mind seared with images no one should ever carry. When he burst into his father's blacksmith shop the next morning, babbling about torture and brain surgery, his words were met with disbelief. His father, a practical man, tried to calm him. "The mind plays tricks in the dark," he said. Perhaps it was a difficult medical treatment. You know, the sisters helped the troubled. But Thomas's details were too vivid to dismiss. He described the layout of the basement, the precise instruments, the clinical indifference of the sisters. This was no fever dream. It was something far worse, the systematic dismantling of a human being. Concerned but cautious, Thomas's father took the matter to Deacon Morrison, Milbridge's most respected citizen. Morrison, a man who had built his life on reason and community stability, knew that reckless accusations could tear their fragile society apart. After all, the Ashford sisters had been model citizens for 5 years, pious, charitable, above reproach. Prominent families had daughters and wives currently undergoing treatment at the convent. "We must tread carefully," Morrison warned. "If we are wrong, we destroy innocent reputations. If we are right, we face something far more terrible." Under the guise of arranging a church fundraising event, Morrison paid the convent a visit. Agatha received him in a sparsely furnished parlor adorned with religious icons and stern portraits of saints. Her demeanor was flawless, warm, attentive, even maternal. Over tea she inquired after his family, spoke humbly of their mission, and explained that the cries heard at night were the result of intensive prayer sessions. "You must understand, Deacon," she said in her polished English accent, "that many of our patients are in great spiritual distress. They are plagued by demons of pride, lust, rebellion. Their purification is neither quick nor painless." The explanation, couched in the language of spiritual warfare familiar to every frontier Christian, was disturbingly plausible. Morrison had heard such sermons all his life: the soul's battle against sin, the painful casting out of evil. Agatha offered to show him the upper levels of the convent clean, austere dormitories where women knelt in silent prayer. They seemed peaceful, though strangely subdued, their movements, mechanical, their gazes distant. Morrison noticed that when he spoke to them, they did not meet his eyes, but stared past him as though looking at something invisible. When he inquired about the basement, Agatha's expression softened with modest sadness. "Our most troubled patients reside below," she explained. "Their care requires privacy. Some of the treatments would be inappropriate for a man to witness." Social custom made her refusal reasonable. In that era, it would indeed have been improper for a man to observe women in vulnerable states of spiritual examination. Morrison left the convent with his doubts temporarily quieted, yet his soul uneasy. There was a wrongness about the place that no polite conversation could erase. After his visit, the sisters adjusted their operations. The screams that had alarmed Thomas were replaced by eerie silence. No longer did the night woods echo with cries of pain. Now there was only stillness, which somehow felt worse. Yet the transformations continued. Women returned to their families, healed but also hollow. Spirited daughters became docile brides. Outspoken wives became obedient shadows. Intellectual curiosity was replaced by mechanical piety. The scars beneath their hairlines told a story few wished to hear. Hartwell, ever the opportunist, documented the sisters' successes with clinical enthusiasm. His journals, sealed after his death, describe procedures to suppress defiance, erase traumatic memories, and correct personality flaws. He justified these horrors as medical progress, convinced that their work would save countless lives in the future. But in the dark corners of his mind, even Hartwell feared what they had become. By 1805, the Convent of Eternal Tears was no longer merely a house of worship. It was a machine cold, efficient, and relentless, dedicated to breaking the human mind and rebuilding it in whatever form society demanded. And the town, profiting from the sisters' gold and lulled by the comfort of easy solutions, said nothing. They had traded truth for peace and peace for silence. But some silences echo louder than screams. The whispers of horror that drifted beyond the convent walls should have been enough to rouse a righteous outcry. But in Millbridge, as in much of the world, fear of scandal proved stronger than fear of sin. Over time, the grotesque rumors were absorbed into the town's uneasy peace, dismissed as exaggerations or explained away as the price of spiritual salvation. What began as isolated curiosity grew into quiet complicity. People preferred to live with unanswered questions rather than face truths too monstrous to name. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, once the town's progressive hope, was now the Ashford sisters' most enthusiastic ally. His journals from these years paint a disturbing portrait of a man seduced by the promise of medical greatness. He spoke in glowing terms of the sisters' ability to eliminate harmful emotional tendencies and reshape disordered minds. What he did not record, at least not in writing visible to the public, was the financial arrangement binding him to their work. For every patient he referred, for every shipment of medical supplies he secured through his network, Hartwell received both payment and exclusive access to the sisters' clinical data. For a physician isolated on the frontier, this was an irresistible offer: wealth, influence, and a place in history. By 1807, the Convent of Eternal Tears had established itself as the premier destination for families across New England, seeking to cure the embarrassing flaws of their women. Daughters, too inquisitive, wives, too independent, mothers who had failed to grieve properly after losing a child, all were sent north to be corrected. The sisters accepted cases from Portsmouth, Hartford, and even as far as Charleston and Philadelphia, their reputation spreading through whispered recommendations and discreet letters. The fees rose accordingly. A single month's treatment cost the equivalent of several months' wages for an average family. The so-called complete reformation, a 6-month process promising permanent behavioral change, commanded hundreds of silver dollars. But for families facing social ruin due to a daughter's stubborn refusal of a marriage proposal or a wife's embarrassing insistence on her own opinions, no price was too high to restore harmony. And indeed, the women returned transformed, but not healed. They came back as shadows of their former selves, quiet, compliant. Their once bright personalities dulled, their conversations reduced to polite nods and rehearsed prayers. The light in their eyes extinguished, replaced by a mechanical obedience that left family members both relieved and unsettled. Mary Prescott was among the first whose transformation drew public notice. Once known in Millbridge for her spirited debates and musical laughter, Mary had scandalized her family by refusing 3 suitors and advocating for women's education. After 6 months at the convent, she returned home, docile, agreeable, and vacant. She accepted the first marriage proposal presented to her without hesitation, her voice soft, her opinions non-existent. At first, her parents rejoiced, but soon they noticed troubling signs. Mary failed to recognize her childhood friends. She could no longer recall the poems she once recited from memory. Her favorite foods, her cherished books, her beloved pet dog, none of these elicited the slightest spark of recognition. When asked about her time at the convent, Mary simply smiled and said, "I prayed very hard to become a better woman." More disturbing still were the scars her mother discovered beneath her hair during washing. Faint but unmistakable symmetrical lines at the base of her skull, far too deliberate to be accidental. When gently questioned, Mary had no memory of any injury. Cases like Mary's became increasingly common. Hannah Morse, who had sunk into melancholia following the death of her infant son, was sent to the convent in desperation. She returned unnaturally cheerful, smiling serenely, as she claimed to have never borne a child. When presented with her baby's clothing, she stared at it as though it belonged to a stranger. Elizabeth Thornton's case was perhaps the most tragic. A merchant's wife, she had been committed for hysteria after publicly accusing her husband of adultery and threatening divorce, a scandal that threatened the family's social standing. 4 months later, she returned home proclaiming her marriage perfectly happy and denying that any accusations had ever been made. Yet her physical condition had deteriorated. Severe headaches confined her to bed for days, and she became confused by simple tasks, frequently forgetting the names of lifelong friends or becoming lost in her own neighborhood. Beneath her carefully styled hair, the same telltale scars were found. And yet, Dr. Hartwell continued his praise. In public, he called the sisters' work a triumph of compassionate science. In private, his journal revealed a man battling his conscience. "The procedures I have witnessed challenge every ethical boundary," he wrote, "and yet the results are undeniable. They have achieved what Europe's greatest minds only theorize, the ability to modify behavior and erase undesirable memories through targeted cranial intervention. But even Hartwell's soul could not withstand the cost forever. His drinking worsened. His lectures at local gatherings became rambling monologues about the sacrifices necessary for progress. He spoke of humanity as raw material to be shaped into virtue by those strong enough to bear the moral burden." By 1810, Hartwell had ceased to be a doctor and had become something else entirely, a missionary of the Ashford sisters' gospel of control. The sisters' growing influence did not go unnoticed by medical institutions abroad. Correspondence flowed between the convent and universities in Edinburgh, Vienna, and Paris. Medical texts, surgical instruments, and chemical compounds arrived regularly by ship. In return, the sisters sent meticulously detailed case studies and some whispered preserved biological specimens. European scholars marveled at the Ashford's findings, publishing theories on behavioral modification without ever disclosing the true horrifying source of their data. The convent's patient list grew more prestigious and more distant. Wealthy families from New York and Charleston began sending their rebellious daughters to Maine, far from the prying eyes of local society. These families paid dearly, some contributing as much as $500 for a 6-month reformation. They received in return daughters who smiled obediently, married the men chosen for them, and spoke only when spoken to. But beneath the facade of success, the first cracks began to show. Martha Goodwin, a local mother, began to question the convent's miracles after her daughter Rebecca returned home. Rebecca, once a lively girl with a passion for painting and storytelling, had become quiet and listless. She no longer painted. She no longer laughed. She no longer seemed present. Martha began discreetly asking other mothers about their daughters. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. None of the women who had undergone intensive treatment could recall their time in the basement of the convent. Their memories of the convent consisted only of fragmented prayers and vague impressions of peace. And worse, several women who had been sent to the convent were simply never seen again. When these families inquired, the Ashford sisters explained that such women had chosen lives of permanent seclusion, dedicating themselves to prayer and silence. Attempts to visit these permanent residents were met with gentle but firm refusal. Their vows of solitude prohibited any contact with the outside world. The pattern was undeniable. The sisters were not just reforming women, they were erasing them. And yet, the town remained silent. The prosperity the convent brought was too precious, the reputations it protected too fragile. No one wanted to be the first to tear away the veil. By 1812, the convent was processing dozens of women each year. Records indicate that over 400 women had undergone successful reformation, though how success was defined remained a matter only the sisters fully understood. Women who died during the procedures were quietly recorded as failures. Their bodies, some suspected, were preserved for further study. As the years passed, the sisters' techniques grew more sophisticated and more horrifying. Prudence Ashford refined her surgical methods, developing precise techniques for targeting specific regions of the brain. Temperance advanced her expertise in behavioral reconstruction, employing sleep deprivation, sensory manipulation, and psychological conditioning to reinforce the effects of surgery. Agatha, ever the scholar, documented it all with clinical detachment, her journals reading more like engineering manuals than medical records. They were no longer simply nuns. They had become architects of the mind, bending human nature to their will with tools forged from cruelty and genius. And the world, hungry for their results, but unwilling to ask how they were achieved, rewarded them with wealth, influence, and the freedom to continue. Millbridge, once a humble frontier town, had become the silent epicenter of one of the most horrifying scientific experiments in American history. And still no one spoke. The question was no longer whether the sisters would be stopped. It was whether anyone had the courage to try. For nearly 2 decades, the Ashford sisters operated without consequence, protected by wealth isolation and the fearful silence of those who suspected the truth, but dared not speak it. But no system of cruelty lasts forever without meeting the one force it cannot tame: defiance. And in the spring of 1818, defiance came to the Convent of Eternal Tears in the form of a young woman named Sarah Whitman. Sarah was unlike the other women who had passed through the convent's gates. She was not a broken soul sent by desperate parents. She was a fighter, a woman whose life had been shaped by both privilege and rebellion. Born to a wealthy Boston merchant family, Sarah had been raised in comfort, but also in conflict. Her father, a man of commerce and status, had provided her with an education rare for women of her time, exposing her to philosophy, science, and medicine through his business connections. But when she fell pregnant out of wedlock at 24 and refused to name the father, a scandal that threatened her family's carefully cultivated reputation, her intellectual upbringing became her greatest crime. Her parents, humiliated and desperate to salvage their social standing, tried to force her into a hasty marriage or to quietly give the child away. Sarah refused both options, declaring her intention to raise the child alone. For this, she was declared mentally unstable, suffering from female delusions of independence, and committed to the Convent of Eternal Tears for spiritual reformation. From the moment Sarah arrived at the convent, she knew something was wrong. The other women moved like shadows, their expressions blank, their voices quiet and rehearsed. Their smiles were too perfect, their silences too complete. It did not take long for Sarah's sharp mind to detect the signs of something far worse than religious discipline. In her first week, she was subjected to the convent's standard intake process, detailed measurements of her skull, exhaustive questioning about her personality traits, and a battery of physical and psychological tests disguised as spiritual assessments. Her medical knowledge allowed her to recognize these procedures for what they truly were: preliminary steps in neurological experimentation. She had read of such methods in the banned European medical journals her father kept hidden in his study. But unlike the broken women who had come before her, Sarah did not submit. No amount of isolation, fasting, or psychological abuse could break her spirit. She endured days in a darkened cell, denied food and water, subjected to whispered condemnations from Sister Temperance, who tried to erode her sense of self-worth with every cruel word. Yet Sarah remained alert, watching, listening, learning. She mapped the convent's routines in her mind, memorized the sisters' schedules, and began planning her escape almost from the day she arrived. Her opportunity came with the spring rains of 1819. A violent thunderstorm flooded the lower levels of the convent, forcing the sisters to relocate equipment and patients to higher floors. In the chaos, Sarah slipped away from her guards and descended into the forbidden basement. What she found there exceeded even her worst fears. The flooded rooms revealed the convent's hidden core operating tables, with blood-stained restraints cabinets filled with surgical tools far too advanced for common medicine, and most horrifying of all, shelves lined with preserved human brains floating in glass jars. Each jar was carefully labeled with a patient's name, the date of the procedure, and the behavioral changes observed. The meticulousness of it all, the cold clinical detachment, made it clear these were not acts of madness. This was science. She found notebooks filled with anatomical sketches, surgical diagrams mapping out regions of the brain and their associated behaviors, and letters exchanged with European physicians negotiating the sale of their research findings. The correspondence revealed a thriving black market trade in human experimentation data, with universities in Vienna, Edinburgh, and Paris paying handsomely for results they could never ethically obtain themselves. Sarah knew that if she did not escape soon, she would join the ranks of those specimens, another name in a jar, another mind erased in the name of progress. In a desperate act, she gathered as much evidence as she could conceal: letters, surgical notes, and one preserved brain specimen sealed in a wax container small enough to fit beneath her cloak. She hid them within the seams of her clothing, knowing that if she were caught, her punishment would be beyond imagination. Her escape was nothing short of miraculous. On a moonless night in early April 1819, she overpowered a guard during a routine transfer between cells and fled into the surrounding forest. The Ashford sisters, realizing what was at stake, mobilized a search party immediately. They knew that Sarah, armed with evidence, could bring their entire empire crashing down. For 3 days and nights, Sarah evaded her pursuers, surviving on spring water and edible roots, her feet torn and bleeding from the rugged terrain. She used her childhood knowledge of the Maine forests, gained from summers spent at her grandfather's logging camp, to hide from the search parties combing the woods. At one point, she hid beneath the hollowed-out trunk of a fallen tree, holding her breath, as the sisters' hired men passed by, just feet away, their torches flickering in the dark. Her salvation came in the form of Joshua Meadows, a local trapper who found her collapsed and delirious near his cabin on the morning of the 3rd day. At first he suspected she was mad, another unfortunate lost in the woods. But when Sarah, through cracked lips and fevered breath, described the convent's hidden chambers, the surgical horrors, and the letters she carried, Joshua realized he was witnessing something real, something terrible. With cautious urgency, Joshua gave her food, warm clothing, and most importantly, safe passage to the sheriff's office in Millbridge. But even as they traveled, Sarah remained terrified that the sisters would find her before she could speak the truth. On April 18, 1819, Sarah Whitman stumbled into the office of Sheriff William Hawthorne. Her appearance, a wild-eyed woman in torn clothing clutching stained papers, initially drew skepticism. But when she described the convent's layout in exact detail, named European doctors only the sisters could have corresponded with, and produced physical evidence of the experiments, Hawthorne realized he was facing a crime beyond anything the frontier had ever known. Her most damning evidence was a surgical log detailing procedures performed on 23 women over an 8-month period. The entries included pre-operative assessments, descriptions of drilling into the skull to target specific brain regions, and post-operative notes on personality changes. The clinical coldness of the language, phrases like subject displays 90% reduction in argumentative tendencies turned the sheriff's stomach. Also among her documents was correspondence from Dr. Hinrich Zimmermann of the University of Vienna negotiating payment for data on personality suppression techniques. The letter explicitly requested procedures for erasing rebellious tendencies in female patients. And finally, there was a patient catalog over 600 names, some marked reformed and returned, others listed as permanent residents, and nearly 200 marked simply as expired. Hawthorne, a man accustomed to tracking fugitives and settling land disputes, found himself facing something monstrous and unprecedented: systematic human experimentation disguised as spiritual care. He acted swiftly. Within days, he assembled a posse of 15 armed men and sent urgent messages to Portland and Boston requesting federal marshals. But the Ashford sisters were not idle. Their network of informants in Millbridge warned them of Sarah's arrival at the sheriff's office. By the time the posse reached the convent on May 20, 1819, it was too late. The building stood empty, cold, and silent. The sisters had vanished in the night, taking with them their most valuable equipment, research notes, and wealth. What remained behind was a house of horrors. In the basement, Hawthorne's men found surgical theaters still stained with blood, rows of preserved brain specimens, and a hidden chamber containing the bodies of 47 women, each tagged with details of the procedures performed on them. Some bodies were perfectly preserved in alcohol. Others bore signs of ongoing study, their skulls open, their brains exposed and partially removed. The documents left behind painted a picture of horror beyond comprehension. 600 women processed through the convent's programs over 21 years. Roughly 250 returned home, altered beyond recognition. 50 were listed as permanent residents, their whereabouts unknown. The remaining 200, well, their remains spoke for themselves. The community, faced with overwhelming evidence, recoiled in horror. But as the investigation deepened, a darker truth emerged. Local officials, postal workers, and even prominent families had knowingly or not helped sustain the convent's operations. Payments had been made, questions had been ignored, and reputations had been protected at the cost of countless lives. Faced with the enormity of their complicity, most chose silence. The investigation, which should have shaken the foundations of the nation, was quietly closed within 6 months. Federal archives sealed the evidence for over a century. The official report spoke only of irregular medical practices and a fraudulent religious institution. The convent of Eternal Tears was burned to the ground by fearful townsfolk hoping to erase their shame. But the scars it left behind in the bodies of its victims, in the silence of the town, and in the stolen knowledge passed quietly through academic circles, could not be so easily destroyed. And somewhere beyond the reach of justice, the Ashford sisters lived on. The dawn that rose over Millbridge on May 20, 1819, revealed a town on the brink of reckoning. Sheriff William Hawthorne and his hastily assembled posse of 15 armed men approached the convent of Eternal Tears. With a grim determination, their boots crunching on damp earth, their rifles heavy in their hands. What they expected to find was a confrontation. What they found instead was emptiness. The great stone building stood silent and cold, as though it had already been abandoned by the living and claimed by something far older. The massive doors, once reinforced against any intrusion, hung slightly ajar, creaking in the morning wind. No sentries greeted them, no hymns drifted through the air. With weapons drawn and hearts pounding, they entered. What awaited them inside was no ordinary crime scene. In the upper levels, the dormitories stood as they had always been, Spartan, immaculate, and disturbingly sterile. Beds were perfectly made books, precisely arranged prayer beads resting neatly on nightstands, as though the inhabitants had simply evaporated into thin air. Candles burned down to wax puddles, meals half-eaten remained on trays. But not a single soul remained. It was in the basement that horror awaited. Descending into the lower levels, the posse discovered the true purpose of the convent. Gone was the facade of spiritual healing. In its place, they found the full machinery of human experimentation. In the surgical theater, the air still thick with the stench of oil lamps and antiseptic herbs. The walls were lined with glass jars containing preserved human brains, each meticulously labeled with names, dates, and clinical notes. Instruments of surgical precision, trephines, cranial drills, and slender rods for probing the living brain were laid out with obsessive order. In adjacent rooms, surgical restraints still stained with blood and hair bore silent witness to the suffering they had contained. The most grotesque discovery lay hidden behind a false wall, a cold chamber filled with 47 bodies in various states of preservation. Some floated in chemical solutions, others lay stretched upon stone slabs, their skulls cut open, the flesh peeled back with scientific detachment. Each corpse was tagged with procedural notes detailing the experiments that had ended their lives. These were not mere victims. They were data point sacrifices to a science stripped of compassion. And yet, despite this mountain of evidence, the Ashford sisters were gone. They had vanished in the night, taking with them their most valuable research portable equipment and a fortune accumulated over 2 decades of secret experimentation. Their escape, as investigators later discovered, had been planned long before Sarah Whitman's flight. Bank records uncovered in Boston, Montreal, and even Havana showed that the sisters had been transferring funds to foreign accounts for months. Shipping manifests from Portland indicated that crates of medical instruments and documentation had been quietly dispatched to European ports under false names. They had built their empire on silence, and when silence was no longer possible, they disappeared into the shadows that had sheltered them all along. Sheriff Hawthorne, faced with crimes beyond anything in his experience, sent urgent requests to Boston, Portland, and New York for federal assistance. Federal marshals arrived weeks later, along with a handful of doctors and legal scholars who could scarcely believe what they found. But as the investigation widened, so too did the realization of just how deep the conspiracy ran. Local officials, it turned out, had been paid to look the other way. Postal workers had knowingly handled crates of surgical supplies and biological specimens. Prominent families had sent their daughters and wives to the convent, had received them back reformed, and had never asked how such transformations had been achieved. The complicity was undeniable. And yet, in the face of public scandal, the machinery of society did what it has always done. When confronted with uncomfortable truths, it protected itself. Within 6 months, the official investigation was quietly closed. The federal report described the convent as a fraudulent medical institution practicing unorthodox treatments. No mention was made of human experimentation, nor of the hundreds of women whose lives had been stolen. The Ashford sisters were listed as fugitives wanted for medical fraud, their far greater crimes erased from the public record. The families of the victims faced an agonizing choice. To pursue justice meant exposing their own failures, their willingness to sacrifice daughters, wives, and sisters for the sake of social conformity. It meant admitting to the world that they had paid for the destruction of those they were meant to protect. And so most chose silence. The convent, a monument to cruelty hidden beneath the guise of faith, was burned to the ground by townspeople desperate to erase its memory. What they could not erase was the evidence now sealed away in government archives, or the knowledge that their silence had allowed it to happen. But the story did not end there. The Ashford sisters had not vanished into oblivion. Over the years that followed, rumors surfaced across continents. In 1825, a report from Mexico City described 3 European women operating a private sanatorium for wealthy families with difficult daughters. In 1838, a French physician claimed to have encountered a Dr. Agatha Brennan in Paris, working under an assumed name as a specialist in nervous disorders in women, her techniques suspiciously similar to those practiced in Maine. Perhaps the most tantalizing sighting came from Argentina in 1847, where travelers spoke of a remote clinic run by 3 elderly sisters offering miraculous cures for female hysteria. By the time investigators arrived, the clinic had been abandoned, its records burned, and its occupants gone. No confirmed sightings ever led to their capture. What the investigation did uncover was the vast influence the sisters' research had already achieved. Universities in Edinburgh, Vienna, and Berlin had unknowingly incorporated their findings into medical curricula. Surgical techniques taught to generations of physicians bore the fingerprints of the Ashford experiments. The horrifying irony was, this knowledge obtained through cruelty had advanced the field of neurology by decades. Techniques for treating epilepsy, understanding brain trauma, and even early forms of psychiatric care were informed, however, distantly by the Ashford sisters' work. The legacy of the Convent of Eternal Tears was not merely one of horror. It was also a legacy of progress built on human suffering. Sarah Wittmann, the woman whose courage had exposed the nightmare, spent the rest of her life haunted by what she had witnessed. After providing testimony to investigators and helping to identify victims, she left Maine and relocated to California under an assumed name. There she worked as a teacher, dedicating her life to educating young women in the hope of sparing them from the fate she had escaped. She never married. Her family distanced themselves from her, embarrassed by her public confrontation with the truth they had tried to suppress. Before her death in 1863, Sarah wrote a memoir documenting her ordeal. It would remain unpublished for over a century, hidden away by a society unwilling to confront the darkness in its past. Only in the late 20th century would her words resurface, providing the clearest account of the horrors that unfolded behind the convent's stone walls. And what of the town of Millbridge? It continued on, much as it always had, its inhabitants rarely speaking of what happened in those woods. The burned ruins of the convent were eventually reclaimed by the forest. Nature, in its quiet way, buried the evidence beneath moss and soil. But beneath that earth, the story remained. Because stories like this never truly die. They remain waiting in the shadows of history, reminding us that cruelty does not always wear the face of monsters. Sometimes it wears the face of respectability, of intellect, of progress. And the most dangerous villains are those who convince the world that what they do is necessary. The question that haunts this tale is not how the Ashford sisters committed their crimes. That answer is terrifyingly simple. They were brilliant, ambitious, and unbound by conscience. The true question is how so many others allowed them to continue. How silence, convenience, and cowardice built a fortress around their cruelty. And if we are honest, we must ask ourselves, how many such fortresses exist today? Hidden not in stone convents, but in corporations, laboratories, and institutions that speak of helping humanity while quietly sacrificing its most vulnerable. The Convent of Eternal Tears burned to ashes in 1819. But the mindset that built it, that still lives. Even as the ashes of the Convent of Eternal Tears cooled beneath the spring rains, its true legacy had only begun to spread. What the townspeople of Millbridge tried to burn away was not merely a building, but an idea. A cruel, cold, and irresistible idea that the human mind could be dissected, reshaped, and controlled. That a person's soul could be reduced to anatomy, and their will to mere circuitry. And ideas, unlike stone and flesh, cannot be destroyed by fire. The Ashford sisters had vanished, but their work did not. In the months following the raid, investigators combed through the mountains of documents, surgical diagrams, and correspondence the sisters had left behind in their haste. What they discovered was not the chaotic ramblings of deranged women, but the systematic records of scientific pioneers without mercy. Every experiment was meticulously logged, every behavioral change cross-referenced with surgical procedures. The documents mapped the human mind with a precision that would not be matched for decades. European universities that had secretly purchased the Ashford sisters' data soon faced uncomfortable questions. But with no clear legal precedent for what the sisters had done and no public appetite to pursue justice, the institutions quietly distanced themselves. Professors in Vienna, Edinburgh, and Paris who had once praised the sisters' groundbreaking work now claimed ignorance of their methods. But the research remained, and over the following decades, fragments of the Ashford's findings quietly found their way into medical journals, neurosurgical practices, and the early studies of what would later become psychiatry. It was in these pages that the sisters lived on. Dr. Heinrich Zimmermann of Vienna, one of the sisters' most lucrative buyers, used their data to refine his own theories on the suppression of trauma through surgical intervention. Though history would credit him as a pioneer in cranial surgery, few would ever learn that his breakthroughs were built on the suffering of hundreds of American women. At the University of Edinburgh, lectures on brain function began referencing regions of the cortex linked to impulse control and emotional response connections, first documented not in British labs, but in a frozen Maine basement. Even in the United States, whispers of the Ashfords' work persisted. Dr. Jonathan Whitmore of Harvard Medical School, who had corresponded with them for years, incorporated their theories into his early teachings on abnormal psychology. Though he never spoke publicly of his relationship with the convent, his private letters discovered after his death revealed a man torn between admiration for their brilliance and horror at their methods. Their understanding of personality modification, Whitmore wrote in 1822, surpasses anything known to European medicine. Yet the cost of such understanding is a price I pray no other soul will ever be forced to pay again. But of course, it was paid again and again. As the 19th century wore on, other physicians, researchers and institutions quietly adopted variations of the Ashford's techniques. Lobotomy, trepanation, and experimental treatments for hysteria became more commonplace, often cloaked in the language of benevolence. The Ashfords had shown the world what was possible, and in doing so had torn open a door that could never again be fully closed. And what of the sisters themselves? The manhunt for Agatha Prudence and Temperance Ashford became one of the largest criminal investigations of its time, spanning North America and Europe. Federal marshals, bounty hunters, and even European constables followed their trail across continents. But the sisters had prepared well. They had false identities, escape routes, and safe houses scattered across the Americas and Europe. Bank records revealed accounts in Canada, Mexico, and Switzerland containing sums equivalent to millions today. The trail of sightings stretched across decades. In 1825, 3 women fitting their descriptions were reported running a remote sanatorium in Mexico. In 1838, a French physician in Paris described an aging woman named Dr. Brennan, whose methods for treating nervous disorders in women bore an eerie resemblance to those used in Maine. In 1847, travelers in Argentina spoke of a secluded medical retreat run by elderly European women specializing in curing rebellious daughters. But whenever authorities closed in, the sisters vanished like smoke, leaving behind only scorched papers and empty rooms. Whether they eventually died in obscurity or continued their work under new identities remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of medical history. The only certainty was that they had escaped justice and perhaps in their own minds had transcended it. Sarah Wittmann, the woman who had exposed them, spent the remainder of her life as both hero and outcast. Though she had saved countless future victims by bringing the convent's crimes to light, society had little tolerance for women who refused to remain silent. Branded as unstable, shunned by her own family, she relocated to California, where she lived under an assumed name, working as a teacher. There, in the quiet of distant mountains, she wrote her memoir, a raw, unfiltered account of the horrors she had witnessed. It would remain unpublished until decades after her death, locked away in archives deemed too disturbing for public consumption. Sarah died in 1863 alone, but unbroken. She never married, never returned to Boston, and rarely spoke of Maine again. Her story, like that of so many women silenced by power, nearly vanished from history. But evil leaves fingerprints, and even the best attempts to erase it cannot scrub them away completely. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Ashford sisters' legacy is not the suffering they inflicted, but the silence that followed. Millbridge itself, the town that had benefited from the convent's gold and influence, quietly buried its shame. Families who had sent their daughters to the convent rarely spoke of it again. Some even denied that the convent ever existed, insisting the entire affair was a fabrication. The ruins of the convent, burned and overgrown by forest, became a place children were warned to avoid. But the forest remembers. In the generations that followed, local legends arose of distant screams carried on the wind of women in black habits, seen walking the tree line at dusk, of cold, hollow eyes staring from beneath the earth. Rational minds dismissed these as ghost stories. But for those who listened closely, the message was clear: some evil never truly dies. And beyond Maine, in the grand lecture halls of medical schools, fragments of the Ashfords' work lived on. Stripped of their gruesome origins, these insights became respected science. Treatments for epilepsy. Early understandings of brain injury and even rudimentary psychiatric practices owed their existence in part to the experiments conducted beneath the Convent of Eternal Tears. It is this terrible paradox that haunts the legacy of the Ashford sisters. Their work advanced human knowledge, but at a cost that no civilization should ever have paid. They proved that progress, when divorced from compassion, becomes cruelty. That genius, when unbound by morality, becomes monstrous. And that the pursuit of control over others' minds, will always lead down a dark and bloody path. Their story leaves us with questions far larger than the confines of Millbridge. How many advances in our own time rest on foundations built from suffering? How many discoveries are lauded as miracles while hiding the ghosts of those sacrificed to achieve them? And how often do we, like the people of Millbridge, choose silence over truth, because the truth would demand too much from us? The Ashford's crimes were buried beneath a conspiracy of silence that spanned oceans and generations. But silence is fragile. Eventually, history whispers through the cracks. In the 20th century, when Sarah Whitman's memoir was finally published, it sparked a brief but intense re-examination of the convent's history. Historians debated whether the sisters were visionaries or villains. Medical ethicists wrestled with the uncomfortable reality that some modern techniques could be traced back to their work. But after the headlines faded, so too did the public's interest. The story became another footnote in the long, dark history of human experimentation. And yet, for those who know where to look, the legacy of the Ashford sisters is still visible today. In the quiet wards of mental hospitals, in the cold sterility of research labs, in the institutional systems that claim to help but too often erase the very humanity they are meant to protect. Perhaps that is the true horror of the Convent of Eternal Tears, not merely the suffering of its victims, not merely the crimes of its creators, but the way in which the world allowed it to happen, and then when confronted with its reality, chose to forget. And so the question remains, are we really so different now? Do we truly believe that such horrors could never happen again? Or have we simply become better at hiding them? The Ashford sisters built a fortress of cruelty in the Maine wilderness, and when it fell, they vanished into the very shadows they had used to hide their crimes. But the ideas they unleashed, the cold, merciless pursuit of control over the human soul, continue to haunt the corridors of power, waiting for the next generation bold enough or cruel enough to open that door once more. In the end, history is not the story of what we destroy. It is the story of what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. In the story of the Convent of Eternal Tears, the real horror isn't just what happened behind closed doors, it's what the outside world allowed to happen through silence. The people of Millbridge weren't evil, but their quiet obedience and fear of scandal made them complicit in unimaginable cruelty. And how often do we in modern life make the same mistake? How often do we turn away from injustice because speaking up feels inconvenient, uncomfortable, or risky? The message here is clear: evil doesn't always wear a terrifying mask. Sometimes it smiles, politely, promises healing, or hides behind progress and respectability. In today's world, we might not see stone convents filled with secret experiments, but we do live in a society where people, especially the vulnerable, are often reduced to numbers, diagnoses, or problems to be solved, rather than human beings to be protected. The lesson is simple, but uncomfortable cruelty survives when good people stay silent. Whether in our workplaces, schools, or communities, injustice thrives when no one stands up. Choosing comfort over courage is how the world becomes a colder, darker place. But it doesn't have to be that way. Every day we are faced with small choices. Do we ignore the suffering of others to protect our peace of mind? Or do we risk discomfort to speak the truth? Do we let institutions and powerful people exploit the vulnerable? Or do we draw a line and say, this is not right? The Ashford sisters may be gone, but the mindset that created them, the cold pursuit of control over others without empathy, still exists in our world. It lives in systems that prioritize profits over people, appearances over ethics, and silence over truth. So the challenge is this in your life: where are you tolerating things that shouldn't be tolerated? Where are you letting silence protect cruelty? What conversations are you avoiding because the truth feels too hard to face? If stories like this make you reflect on the world around you, hit subscribe and join our growing community of people who dare to ask hard questions. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear this message and be part of the change that breaks the cycle of silence. Because evil doesn't disappear when we ignore it. It disappears when enough of us refuse to look away.